Masal khair. Good evening. Bonsoir. Welcome to the Tangier Forum for Global Studies. I know people are watching us not only in this room, but people are watching us right now in France, the United States, Mexico, and other places. So I say, hola, merci, thank you guys for watching us. It promises to be a great event tonight, and I'll tell you why in a few seconds. I want to thank all of you for making it today. This is a very special event. As I said before, we are trying to make Tangier one of the major places for discussions about some of the great issues facing us today. A lot of people in Morocco and other places in Europe and other places have big questions about the United States, especially on the topic of civil rights. They have been watching the news, you have been watching the news, and you saw some of the tragic events that unfold in that country, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions about what's going on in the United States when it comes to issues of civil rights. And we have no better speaker in the United States or anywhere else in the world who's more capable of addressing this issue than Dr. Robert Franklin. And so, without saying much about the topic, and I will leave all the conversation to him, I want to introduce him. He is Dr. Robert Michael Franklin, Jr., is the James T. and Berta Laney Professor of Moral Leadership at Emory University, which is a major university in Atlanta, Georgia, and Director of the Religion Department of the Chautauqua Institution, which is also a major forum in the state of New York that takes place every summer and brings together people from around the globe to talk about issues of major concern to humanity. In 2014, he served as Senior Advisor for Community and Diversity at Emory University. And in 2013, he was a visiting scholar in residence at Stanford University's Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. He is President Emeritus of Morehouse College. That means he used to be a president of a university, where he served as 10th president of the nation's largest private four-year liberal arts college for men from 2007 through 2012. Franklin is the author of 3 books: Crisis in the Village, Restoring Hope in African American Communities, Another Day's Journey, Black Churches Confronting the American Crisis, and Liberating Visions, Human Fulfillment and Social Justice in African American Thought. He has co-authored with Don S. Browning and others a volume titled From Culture Wars to Common Ground, Religion and the American Family Debate. He also penned the foreword to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, reprinted by Trinity Forum in 2012. And we are very lucky at the University of New England because in May, he will be our commencement speaker and thus get to speak to a different audience and share with them some of his thoughts. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Franklin to the podium.
Thank you a great deal, and thank you for your presence here this evening. I am aware that simultaneous translation is occurring, and I will attempt to speak fairly deliberately so that those translations can proceed without difficulty. My wife, Cheryl, and I are pleased to be part of this great series of conversations sponsored by the University of New England here in Tangier. I would like to express my appreciation to President Daniel Ripich and to my dear friend Anouar Majid, who is a global citizen and a public intellectual. 2 years ago, we welcomed him to speak at the historic Chautauqua Institution in Western New York, where he broadened our understanding about religion, politics, and civil society. Also, I am grateful to the U.S. Ambassador Dwight Bush, who was present for the opening of the Tangier Global Studies program, and for the hospitality of the embassy here while in country. My wife and I traveled and arrived on Sunday, despite the challenges of the air traffic controller strike in France, and we had a very long day in the Paris airport. We finally arrived, and then, of course, 2 days later, tragic events in Brussels. And so this evening we pause and we reflect on all those who are suffering, our sisters and our brothers in Brussels and throughout Europe this evening. I invite you to think about what we learn about human nature and about American society, since that is our focus this evening, and about other societies, indeed all human societies, by looking at the long incremental process of granting full civil rights to African American citizens. During my talk, I will occasionally allude to African American citizens as a way of designating this particular segment of the U.S. population, and use that term interchangeably with the language of black citizens, which both terms continue to be used in vogue today. This has indeed been a long march for civil rights in America. For those who study this era, there is a fascinating lesson about human determination, suffering, and sacrifice to secure human rights. But the larger story is about what some human beings did to other human beings during this period. And in the end, we may speculate about whether what Black Americans experienced in America offers clues about how some Americans are today prepared to treat Muslim Americans. What can we learn from the Black experience to resist discrimination that might be useful as we resist discrimination toward Muslims, and help America and the world become more tolerant, safe, and peaceful? I would like to suggest 4 categories that may be applied to understanding the long unfolding march toward civil rights in America. Ideas, individuals, institutions, and innovations. 3 of these are inspired by the brilliant work of historian Oswald Spengler, the great historian of the Roman Empire. And so we began elements of this long march toward civil rights. Number 1, ideas. The writer and philosopher Victor Hugo said, "More powerful than the might of all the armies on earth is an idea whose time has come." What are the 3 big ideas that humans have embraced in their short time on this planet? What would you nominate as the 3 biggest ideas? For millennia, humans were preoccupied with the idea of the ultimate. In most cases, the ultimate was spoken of as the idea of God, the idea of the holy. From this quest, the great world religions have emerged. Tragically, disagreements about the idea of God have led to war and to violence. But there are other big ideas that appear on my short list, including the idea of freedom and the idea of justice, fairness. You can construct your own list of the world's greatest ideas. most important ideas. Ideas about human freedom and social justice guided the long march for civil rights. The eminent historian of religion, Charles Long, American scholar, has suggested that every 100 years, approximately every 100 years, America must undergo a revolution in order to recalibrate its moral compass, its public sense of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. Indeed, the British occupied North America since the early 17th century. But by 1776, they began an argument about the idea of freedom. In monarchical societies, only one person was considered to be truly free, only the royal one. In the oligarchy or oligarchic societies, a few were free. But in a popular democracy, all were thought to be free. That was the claim that the young founders of the American Republic embraced. I include that adjective, young founders, deliberately, and not simply because most of those who were gathered in the auditorium, this beautiful auditorium in Tangier this evening, happened to be young. But rather, we tend to forget that the men and women, mostly men in the foreground, women often in the background, who created this new nation we call the American Republic, were really quite young. They are often depicted in photographs in their powdered wigs and powdered faces, and they almost deliberately made themselves appear older than they were. But in fact, in 1776, more than a dozen of them were 35 years of age or younger. Among the older leaders were George Washington, who became the first president of the United States. He was 44 in 1776 when this first revolution occurred. Patrick Henry, the great advocate and voice for freedom and independence, was 40. Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence, 33 years old. Alexander Hamilton was 21. And Thomas Paine, only 39 years of age. Many others were in their 20s. It's only Benjamin Franklin, who was regarded as the grand old man in the group, offering wisdom. He was 70 in 1776. They fought a revolution for the idea of independence and freedom. It was a big and bold idea, perhaps too bold even for their brains to fully contain and comprehend. For when it came to applying that same principle of freedom to women and to African Americans and to the Indian or Native American population, there was once again argument and disagreement about the meaning and application of that grand and noble idea of freedom, human freedom. Nearly 100 years later, a war was fought. A civil war, we called it, for civil rights. But it was also a violent argument about the idea of freedom. By 1870, the war was concluded, the war was won. African slaves were free, and they were made citizens. And the men in that community had the right to vote. It would take another 50 years of argument to enfranchise women, permitting them to vote in 1920. And then following that period of the 1860s, more or less 100 years after the founding of the American Republic, 100 years later, small groups of people came together to restart the argument about the meaning of freedom. Once again, younger people played an essential role in leading the modern civil rights movement. When Rosa Parks engaged in an act of nonviolent civil disobedience by refusing to yield her seat on a bus, on a segregated, racially segregated bus, she was supported by other women, religious and secular women, children, college students, and young ministers. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was only 26 years old as the bus boycotts began in the state of Alabama, he emerged as a young symbol of the American civil rights struggle. In 1963, he was arrested and placed in a jail in the city of Birmingham in the state of Alabama in the American South. While he sat inside a jail cell, he turned the jail into a classroom, and he wrote a response to a letter published by local religious leaders who urged him to leave town because he did not reside in Birmingham. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had no paper. Someone gave him a pen with which to write, and he utilized the margins of the newspaper to write his response. When he completed or filled the space in the margins, he found scraps of paper and continued his response to the religious establishment. These scraps of paper were smuggled out of the jail by his lawyer, and they were later assembled, typed, and published as the letter from Birmingham jail. I would like to recommend that to all of you who are listening and viewing now, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. It was an important letter because it was the most clear, succinct, or short, compressed presentation of the moral reasons for civil disobedience and protest. Martin Luther King Jr. established himself as a public intellectual. That is, he provided compelling answers to large questions for a broad audience in short form, aimed at recalibrating, adjusting the moral compass of the nation. I'd like to repeat that definition of the public intellectual because many of you are and will function as public intellectuals. Women and men who offer compelling answers or responses to large and important questions, speaking to a broad, diverse audience in the short forms, not long books, but short articles, manageable, digestible articles, and aimed at correcting injustice. Ultimately, the public intellectual, and America's most famous public intellectual, spoke at the University of New England campus some months ago, Noam Chomsky, who was a guest of Anouar Majid there in Maine. The public intellectual thinks with and thinks for the people to produce a better society. In August 1963, and if you have seen the poster for the program this evening, you saw this extraordinary picture of what I am about to describe. 250,000 people gathered in the capital of America, in Washington, D.C., gathered on August 28, 1963, for a great rally. That day they heard several speakers, but the one that was most memorable was young Martin Luther King, Jr. It was the largest outdoor mass rally in the nation's capital to date. A multiracial, interreligious coalition assembled to make a statement about this idea of freedom and justice. The nation heard Martin Luther King deliver the most memorable speech, some argue, of the 20th century. It is titled, "I Have a Dream." So that's your second assignment. I urge you to read the words, to check on the internet, and you will find Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream." Later that day, after the rally in Washington, D.C., Martin Luther King and a small group of other civil rights leaders met with the President of the United States, who, as you recall then, was John F. Kennedy. The purpose was to discuss passage of the Civil Rights Act. They met in 1963, and that act was later passed in 1964. But as you know, President Kennedy was assassinated that same year in November of 1963. The March on Washington, August 1963, Kennedy is shot in Dallas, Texas, and killed November 1963. It fell to his vice president, who became the new president of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to take up advocacy of the Civil Rights Act. It was passed, as I said, in 1964, and it is interesting to note that Martin Luther King and President Johnson often alluded to the scrutiny of the international community as the long march for civil rights was advancing. Recall at this time, nations throughout Africa and Asia were demanding their independence and freedom. Indeed, this had become a global argument about the meaning of independence, freedom, and justice. Morocco achieved independence from France and Spain in 1956. I think this is important because as every nation implements its idea of freedom and of justice, it needs the larger community of nations to hold it accountable to more universal standards of good and right. Now, we have already begun to segue or to shift from the focus on ideas to individuals, our second element. Ideas are never disembodied, no matter what the philosopher Plato might say. They're never floating ideals out there, but they are rather held and they are embodied in actual women and men. And so I turn now to the element number two, individuals as moral exemplars or moral examples. The long march to civil rights in America required individuals who could make ideas come alive and were willing to sacrifice everything to realize them. Martin Luther King was one of those people, but there were many others. I have mentioned the young woman who was a seamstress, Rosa Parks, who disobeyed unjust laws, who protested injustice. But there were also United States presidents who supported broader understandings of freedom and justice. President Kennedy, President Johnson. There were college students, some of them at the predecessors to the University of New England, who left their campuses to participate in occasional mass marches and peaceful rallies to express their commitments to a more inclusive and robust idea of freedom, justice, and community. Students also paid the ultimate price during this time. They paid the price of their lives to make America's democracy more authentic. I mentioned 3 names of young people who were important in the long march toward civil rights. Andrew Goodman, who's 20 years old. James Chaney, who's 21 years old. And Michael Schwerner, who's 24 years old. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner lived in New York and traveled to Mississippi in the South. Young James Chaney was an African American community leader, and they were working to register people to vote. And as people were beginning to register, their churches were attacked. Their houses of worship were bombed and set afire. And so these 3 young men entered an automobile one night to go and investigate the burning of a local church. While on the road, in a dark road in rural Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, they were stopped by the local police. They were taken and arrested, and they were taken to jail. They were then released, but they were released to some of the local townspeople, the local citizens who were members of an organization we regard today as a terrorist organization in America, the Ku Klux Klan. They were not seen again alive. They were beaten, they were murdered, and they were found sometime later. The big point here is that a good society, recall I spoke earlier of how important it is for every nation, as it implements its idea of freedom and independence, to be held accountable by the community of nations. I think that's the mission of the United Nations today. But here we focus on individuals, that every good society requires moral citizens, moral leaders for its continuous improvement and regeneration. I define moral leaders as women and men who live and lead with integrity and imagination to serve the common good, while seeking to inspire other people to be better people. Leadership matters. But the great sociologist Max Weber reminds us that there are different types of leadership. And effective organizations demonstrate the ability to learn from and respect these different leadership styles. During the Civil Rights Movement, there were bureaucratic leaders, for instance, the lawyers, the people who worked inside offices, managing documents and managing money They too were important to the success of the movement, although they were not protesting in the streets. They were inside offices, playing their important role, making their important contributions. Bureaucratic leaders. But then Weber says there were also charismatic leaders. These were the leaders who had the ability to inspire people through their speech and through the power of oratory and organizing people. They were able to move a movement from a few to a mass movement. Charismatic leaders. Charisma from the Greek word referring to giftedness, a gift for connecting and inspiring people. But then there were grassroots leaders, as we call them in America, local community leaders, often women, who know the names and the birthdays of all of the children in the neighborhood, who are the mothers and the grandmothers who care for the people when they are sick. That is an important contribution that was made as well. And then there were traditional leaders, leaders who were elected, who had offices and titles, and who were professionals in their jobs. For instance, the judges who sat on the United States Supreme Court, who ruled on, made judgments about many of the legal cases that came before them that made the civil rights movement possible. Progress occurs when each sector category of leaders are effective at their jobs. Now, some scholars of social change note that movements like civil rights, women's rights, the rights of the LGBTQ community require at least a two-stage change process. First, there are legal and policy changes that establish new boundaries for what and who is included as a full citizen. Legal and policy change, followed by step two, building mass consensus for this new vision, new understanding of freedom and inclusiveness. Law changes the playing field, and then hearts are changed. Third, institutions, the legacies of social movements. I see institutions as the elongated shadow of visionary individuals, of those who came together to invent something that they could not do alone. The institution preserves the vision of those early people, those inventors, those dreamers that move us in a new direction. That is how schools like this are born, how hospitals are built, how business companies, the company that manufactured your mobile phone, how they are launched, even how religious congregations, mosques, churches, temples, how they are incubated, how they grow. A group of people committed to a new vision, sustain that commitment over time, and it becomes an institution. The anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt the power of a committed few to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. America's civil rights progress was largely led by movements and organizations that resisted discrimination, resisted unfairness, and resisted exploitation. The labor movement, the movement of workers, the women's movement, the child welfare movement, the anti-poverty movement, the peace movement, and the legal reform movement, and many, many others combined during those years to say no to racism, no to violence. They achieved the passage of laws that provided rights and protection of those rights. And they elected politicians. Here we're describing how institutionalization occurs. The people came together, they pass laws, they elect new leaders, the leaders enforce those laws, and over time, opinions and values change. Most of these social movements took institutional form as they became lasting, as we say in the United States, not-for-profit organizations, which is to say they are not government-sponsored, nor are they sponsored by companies or businesses in the market, but rather they are part of a third sector, an independent sector, or the not-for-profit sector, oriented toward service and community improvement. Organizations, one example during the Civil Rights Movement was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, as we say, in 1910 established. These groups played a key role in creating a legal and policy infrastructure for a new understanding of American democracy. But they also helped people experience the private internal revolution or change that was necessary if all people were to live together in peace. In order for Anglo and European Americans to regard Africans, Latinos, people from South America and Central America, Asians, Arabs, Jews, and others as equal persons, as equal neighbors, they would have to experience a kind of conversion, a change of heart and mind, and a purging and emptying of former prejudices, stereotypes, and assumptions of privilege and power that were part of their childhood nurture. Beyond how they were taught and reared in their own homes, even their environments reinforced their privilege and the inferiority of everyone else outside their group. Enlightened leaders in the white community recognized that this assumption of privilege and supremacy was a recipe for future disaster and required a moral revolution to accompany the legal and policy revolutions that were being achieved in the courts and through mass protest. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. It's a privilege not to have to think about your race every minute of the waking day. One could argue that President Bill Clinton, or even the earlier President Bush, represented visionary leaders from the southern United States who worked for a more fair and inclusive society. Mr. Clinton, in particular, was one of the few national leaders in the white community who spoke of the need for national conversations in America about race, difference, and shared values. He did this, I think, not only for black citizens in America, but he was thinking about his own daughters and children. Today, American institutions that were established during the era of racial exclusion are now working hard to understand and embrace all of their history, to reckon with its tragic and negative elements, and most importantly, to chart a better future forward. Consider Harvard University's law school, as it, this evening, seeks to redesign a crest and a logo that does not contain a Confederate or racist family's identity and narrative. Princeton University is struggling with the proposal to rename one of its esteemed schools after students protested a former university president and U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, who often exhibited racist and anti-Semitic attitudes. Several states in the United States have removed the Confederate battle emblem from their official state flags. Today, only Mississippi, the state of Mississippi in the South, retains a Confederate symbol on its flag. Institutions have changed and continue to change in order to make civil rights a reality for all people. Where some institutions are making no progress or slow progress, new tactics are being used to accelerate the presence of diversity in all dimensions of American life. Fortunately, social science confirms that human beings make better decisions when the group that makes those decisions is as diverse and as talented as possible. Institutions matter because they help to socialize us, even when we're not aware of it. We should ensure that those institutions have the ability to also discover, correct their mistakes, and improve themselves. Ideas, individuals, especially moral leaders, and institutions, especially self-correcting institutions, have contributed to the triumph of the civil rights movement. But finally, let us consider another word that also, at least in the English language, begins with the letter I: innovation. As the civil rights movement was unfolding, so was the rate of invention and innovation in communications technology. History changed in 1957 when Russia, the nation of Russia, launched its satellite, Sputnik, which orbited the Earth. The race to control space led to a flurry of innovations and inventions. This took the form of several technological and product distribution revolutions. Some have called this part of the post-World War II era the era of mass culture. Consider three amazing developments. Northwestern University in the state of Illinois, sociologist Alden Morris notes that the number of homes of American households with television sets inside the house increased from 0.4% in 1948, 0.4 in 1948, to 55.7% in 1954, just a few years later. More than half of American households had a television set. And then it increased to 83% just 4 years later. So that decade between 1947 and 1957 was an extraordinary technological distributional revolution where nearly every household had a television set. Second, during the 1950s, those large, bulky television cameras, many of you too young to remember these, they were rapidly being replaced by small, portable cameras and wireless microphones that enabled reporters for news companies to get closer to their stories. In fact, to move with the unpredictable and rapidly developing events in the streets during protest marches. This was a precursor to the mobile phone cameras we all have with us this evening. And those cameras today have changed the way we live our lives. They've changed how police behave, how government officials behave, and they have expanded what we know about what happens in places far from our homes. Portable photographic and videographic technology. And third, with the success of President Kennedy, who was a true media star, a television star almost, the usual 15-minute evening news format in the United States, that back then, every evening, Monday through Friday, was 15 minutes devoted to reporting on international, national, and local news. But during this same period, that time doubled, and it became a 30-minute evening news program, which is what it is still today in most of the United States. As a consequence, although I should note that today, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN are now 24-hour news programs, raising the question, are we really better off watching and knowing all the news all the time? I leave that for you to decide. But during these same years, the moral drama of the civil rights movement was unfolding in America's streets. And its star was young Martin Luther King, Jr. Martin Luther King was a graduate of Morehouse College, the college I was privileged to serve as president. And he was the product of a strong family and a strong religious upbringing, committed to serving others. But suddenly, with the television technology, the terrors of the Ku Klux Klan, terrors against black people and Catholics and Jews and others, along with the moral glamour of Martin Luther King, were suddenly being broadcast into the households of ordinary Americans every evening. All of America was learning something new about itself as they watched this moral drama unfold. King thought this was a good thing because he believed that as people watched, they would learn, and their fund or quotient of empathy for other citizens would expand. And he believed that expanding capacity to empathize with others was the mark of a morally mature person. Martin Luther King immediately began to expand the context and scope of his small Southern civil rights movement. He began to speak of that struggle in the Southern United States as intertwined with the struggle of Palestinians, of Jews, of the Vietnamese, of nations in the Arab, African, Asian, and South American world struggling for independence. Dr. King had become a global moral leader, and he was, as they say in the world of television, he was good copy. People enjoyed looking at him and listening to him talk as he quoted philosophers and great writers like Shakespeare. He made them think more deeply about the meaning of human freedom and our connectedness to one another. This may be a clue to how Muslim communities today must wage a relentless public relations and public education campaign to introduce yourselves again and again and again for the 10th time to Western communities that lack experience with Muslim communities, and Western communities that are often victims of the media's oversimplification and distortion of complex truths. Remember the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead's admonition: seek simplicity and distrust it. In conclusion, we have suggested that the long march for civil rights in America was the result of at least 4 interconnected developments: ideas, individuals, institutions, and innovations. The greatest validation of this moral achievement was the election of President Barack Obama. A nation that had once enslaved Black people later excluded and humiliated them, only at last, after the triumph of ideas, institutions, individuals, interracial relationships and friendships, scientific and technological innovations, that nation finally elected a Black president. America did something that perhaps few other nations on the planet today would do: elect a member of a formerly excluded and despised minority group as its chief executive. Despite this achievement that required Blacks and whites and other groups to work together, there remains discrimination and prejudice and bias toward people of color, and increasingly toward some people of faith. The movement today known as Black Lives Matter is a new manifestation of this old paradigm or model of how ideas, individuals, institutions, and innovations come together to advance a society and change or eradicate injustice. America is still learning how to listen and to respond to Black Lives Matter. Now, with fear and ignorance about Islam in America and around the world, we must ask if the moral muscles the nation is developing in accepting Black people as full participants in American life, those same moral muscles can be exercised to welcome Muslim Americans and immigrants. This is an urgent conversation today. With the rise of U.S. presidential candidates, some of whom are using anti-Islamic rhetoric to manipulate voters, and with the continuing terror committed by ISIS and other groups, as my wise and courageous friend Anouar Majid has said, we must have an honest conversation about these difficult topics. Perhaps our conversation can contribute to the historical memory, the moral muscle, the courage, and the civility we need to advance this difficult dialogue in Morocco, in the United States, throughout Europe, and around the world. A final word about an agenda for our moral muscles, as I'm using that metaphor. Finally, number one, I think we need to listen to the narratives of the least advantaged members of the society. This is a requirement, according to the Harvard moral philosopher John Rawls. This could lead to increased empathy for the experience of young Muslims, especially those born after September 11, 2001, or 9/11, who've grown up in a nation where all of their lives they have felt somehow they did not belong, and yet they are Muslim Americans. For instance, although these statements were controversial, and perhaps controversial because they were substantial, I call attention to two interesting song texts or popular texts in our culture that unfolded just in recent months, so it's easy to find them on YouTube. The first was in February, the halftime performance of the American football event known as the Super Bowl. The halftime performance provided by the artist Beyonce. And the second text or observation about the state of our society, American society, was during the Grammy Awards, awards given for extraordinary performances in the world of music. Grammy Awards winner Kendrick Lamar and his extraordinary album or CD, To Pimp a Butterfly. These are two moments, Beyonce's Formation and Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, that offered insight into the pain our young people feel in the streets and the pain that rulers of nations need to be attentive to as you seek to socialize and integrate those young people into the society. Listen, all of us, to the pain and anger, and let us work with these communities. Listen to the messages of Moroccan hip-hop artists raging against injustice in Casablanca, calling us to resolve problems and expand opportunities. We must now enable Muslim voices to arise and tell their stories. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. It's a privilege not to have to think about your religion and culture defensively every minute of the waking day. Second item on this moral muscle agenda, to cherish the lives of these young people by investing in education, in jobs, and in opportunities for integrating their voices into the mainstream of society. And once again, the arts and even popular television programs and commercials can help us to change our mental maps of who belongs and who is a member of our society. Cherish the lives of those young people. And third, adopt a more aggressive and innovative approach to building partnerships that include actors, players who were formerly excluded or invisible. For instance, often when meetings occur to discuss the future of a community or province or a nation, often religious leaders are not invited to those meetings. Often imams and mosques are not included. But even radio disc jockeys or DJs, the personalities we hear on our radio stations, the hip-hop artists and others need to be included. For in the future, we will need new voices in the room and new brains at the table working together to solve our deepest intractable social problems. So let us remember the words of the German poet Goethe, who said, "At the moment of commitment, the entire universe conspires for your success." Thank you for listening.